In order to trigger a dialog the dialog from ORK Framework, we need an interaction component or controller. So let's open up our player GKC-ORK variant here in prefab mode. Select the player controller game object and let's create a empty game object, child of it, create empty, and let's rename this guy interaction controller. Now what we can do is to focus select to get near this object. I will decrease the size of the gizmos. Oh, they were already maybe something like that. Much better. And now that we have selected this game object, let's go to the window, Game is Love, Machinoms in Wizard, and let's select the add component, and in this case it's going to be an interaction controller 3D. Okay, there we go. Now this controller or this component will add automatically a rigid body and a box collider, as we can see here, but the placement is totally wrong. So let's change the component's position to one in the Y and one in the Z, so it will move towards the player and up. Also, this component is assigning this game object into the ignore raycast layer. What we want to change here in this interaction controller component is interact with nearest, so check that one, and we can leave the ignore distance and the position of set the default value we have here, so nothing actually. Okay, so the next step is go up in the hierarchy and select the character game object. Let's collab all the components and let's add a new component, which is the POS game handler Machinom. This component has a couple of functions that we need to call from the menu POS script or behavior. So let's expand that one and let's scroll all the way down until we start seeing the events settings, and then we have use events on pause resume and event on resume pause, so on and so forth. So let's check this one, and then we can add a new entry in this event on pause game. Let's select the character game object and drag it in the runtime in the object slot, and in the functions, if we scroll down, we can see our POS game handler Machinom, and of course for this one we need to call the POS game. Down in the resume game, let's add a new entry as well. Do the same to drag the character game object, and in the functions list, scroll all the way and select resume game. So after doing this, whenever we post the game via GameKit controller menu system, this will also pause a Machinom game loop, so it will post the Machinom game as well. At this point we can save the prefab and close prefab mode. Now that we have a combatant controller with interaction, we can create a simple NPC to trigger the dialogue. So let's go into our GameKit controller folder. Then we can select in the prefabs AI and dummy AI, this dummy character, which is using the Ethan model. So let's create a variant of this prefab again by right-clicking, create prefab variant, and let's rename it to MPC test org, and of course let's move this to our prefabs folder. There we have it. Let's open this prefab to edit, and in the transform let's zero out the rotation. So now it's facing forward as expected. So in order to trigger an interaction with this MPC, we need to add a interaction machine component to it. So let's select in the root, and we can either use the Machinum wizard or just add the component here and select interaction machine. We want to change the start type to interact. Down below in the machine execution settings, we see that we need to add a schematic asset to run some schematic when an interaction occurs with this MPC. So there is another schematic already created for us in the integration from Andy Miira. Let me scroll down and see if I can find it. So here again, Machinum.org integrations, schematics, and we have this dialog simple test. So drag this out into the schematic asset slot and scroll down, and here in the object turn settings we want this MPC to turn or rotate towards the whatever game object is initiating this this interaction. So click on turn starting object, and the last step here is if we scroll down into the condition settings, we want to add an in control condition. So this means that we want the interaction to occur only when the Machinum system or the player is in control, so it's not being blocked already. For example, during the pause menu, so it will automatically create for us this in control condition where it says that the condition time is the game state, check on always, and what game state we need to check, that the game the player is in control or the player can be moved, let's say. Okay, so at this point we can save the exit the prefab mode, and let's double click the dialog simple test to edit. What we need to do here in this schematic is click on the settings of the schematic itself and make sure that the block player control and block camera control is checked. Then if we scroll down into the actors section, make sure that the first actor 0 is set to ORK player, which is already set like that, and the second actor is set to the machine object that has this schematic. This is optional, but good to have it. And we can see it also here that is going to set the name of the game object to MPC test, for example. Okay, alrighty, the next step is in the next node. So we need to make sure in both show dialog nodes, right, that the, if we scroll up, the dialog type is set to message and to wait on both, and of course that the UI box is set to default. So it will use the default layer to draw the dialog box. So on both, of course, message, wait, and UI box to default. Nothing to change in the rotate. This will use the machine object to actually rotate to the player, as we mentioned before. So after making these changes, we can save the schematic and close the editor. So back to the scene, of course, let's drag the NPC to the scene. Let me check where the spawn point of the combatant is. So let's select our prefabs, NPC test controller or test ORK, and let's drag it up maybe over here, right? Something like that. Just making sure it's not below the terrain. Alrighty, so at this point we could test it out. So let's make some room and click on play. Okay, so let's move towards the dummy character, and if we hit enter, there we go, we have our dialogue, so we can move through all the lines, and that's it. So if you encounter any issue triggering the dialogue, make sure the interaction component is covering or at least touching the capsule of the NPC to actually trigger the machine component here. You can see that, for example, let's do a Ctrl-Alt-P to enter pose mode and go to the scene view. So if I were to select again the player and player controller where the interaction component is, we can see, I hope you can see that here is the component, and it's actually and Ethan is inside the component, so make sure it's like so, otherwise it will not trigger the dialogue, of course. Okay, the 3D tutorial demo that comes with ORK, it doesn't have an interaction or interact HUD to display. So that's something that you can add if you want to have something pop up when there is an interactable object near the player. But I will not cover that now because I already done that in previous videos a lot. So let's move on. One thing though I forgot to showcase here is, let's hit play again. Whatever Unity wanted. Okay, so if we again go to Ethan, we are supposed to interact, right? But what about if we press the pause button? So now in control of Machinum should be turned off, and we can debug that by going through the don't destroy unload game object, or let's say scene. Then in Machinum game object we have the Machinum handler, and we can see all the statuses, and right away we can see the game pause is set to true. So actually the component is working properly, so it's setting the Machinum loop to be paused as well. If we leave the pause menu, now we can see game pause to false, and we can interact. And this is the place do you need to go to see all or try to debug or troubleshoot stuff with ORK, as well as selecting, so let me do pause mode again, as well as selecting in the player controller, in the combatant component, what is going on here. So we have, for example, game players, the statuses that we talk about, and so on and so forth. So this is the way you can debug and troubleshoot issues with ORK Framework. Great. So now let's move out to creating the game key controller and ORK stats bridge. Okay, let's start by opening up the player one game key controller ORK prefab. And we need to search for the experience level stat system child game object. This is placed under the other player systems, and then inside the essentials component we have the experience level stat system. Let's expand the right panel, the inspector, and I will collapse all the components in this inspector, so collapse all. And what we need to add is the external stats manager. So let's click on add component and start typing external stats manager component. There we go. And it is asking us to select the main player stat system, which in this case is this game object experience level stat system that has the this player, the player stat system. So let's drag this game object into here, and we can see that it's actually mapped to the player stats system, which is over here. Now we need to add the bridge component from the integration. So let's start typing game kit component controller, underscore ORK stats bridge. Select that one, and once again it's asking us where the main player stat is. So we can either drag again the game object over here or drag the component. Either way will work. And the external stats manager that we added before, so we do the same, and the slot will find it over here. And the last slot is the combatant game object, so which in this case is the player controller. This is the game object that will have the combatant ORK combatant component. So let's drag it out here. Okay, so now we have this list, or this this item here for the stats itself. If we expand this, it's an empty list, so we need to start adding the mapping between game key controller stats and ORK Framework stats. So if we click on the plus button, it will add a new entry, and we can see that we have something like called transfer mode and game key controller stat and ORK stat. So the transfer mode is the way that we are going to choose either to let game key controller handle the stats, or either ORK, or both. Transfer can be also both ways, but in this case let's select ORK Framework to game key controller. So the stats, the change in the stats from ORK Framework will be transferred to game key controller. And for the game key controller stats, we select the current health, and it's going to be mapped to the ORK stat health HP in this case. So remember, this information from ORK is coming from the Machinome editor, so let me show you quickly and not get you confused. And the reason we have those here in the status values. So this status, at least the max is HP, stamina and experience, I believe those comes out of the box when you start any ORK Framework project. So this is the map that we have here. Okay, let me close up Machinum Editor and let's add a new entry. This case is going to be again ORK to GameKit controller. Instead of the current health, let's select the max health from GameKit controller, and it's going to be mapped to the max HP. Okay, we could also, let's do the same for stamina and experience. So let's select a new one, and from GameKit controller, stamina and ORK stamina, and lastly the experience. So that will be experience and ORK stat exp. There we go. Now we can save the changes in the prefab. And close it out. And of course, to test this out, we need an enemy. So we can either create a combatant or an enemy from the prefab some GameKit controller, or create a behavior type of combatant like a trap or something like that. But let's follow up the documentation as I mentioned. So let's go to the GameKit controller prefabs, and let's search for the AI main template prefab. So prefabs AI, and there we go, AI main template prefab. So this is like the enemy that we are going to be working with, and let's create a variant of it. So once again, right click, create prefab variant, and let's rename it to AI main template prefab _ ork. And let's move this guy into our prefabs folder. There we go. Let's select the prefab, the variant, and open up in prefab edition mode. Make sure the transform is 0 out, and then we can select the AI player controller ARM game object. Let's collapse everything here, and let's add a add combatant component to it. Add combatant component. So which combatant is going to be this? This is something that we need to create now. So let's actually go to GameSlov Machinum Editor, and let's jump into the combatants tab, then combatants section. So what I will do is to select the chomper enemy and copy it, edit text, and I will rename this guy to GameKit controller enemy. Similarly, in the base settings, I want to change the prefab to my AI main template prefab. And in the animations and movement, we need to remove the jumper animation set, as well as in the status settings. We can see that this enemy is going to start with 18 health, so let's change this to 100, max stamina to 50 perhaps, and we can leave everything else because we are not mapping attack and range attack yet. So let's save the settings, click confirm. Now we have a new enemy combatant. that we can select in the combatant settings. So in the faction, let's make sure to select enemies, and in the combatant, the game key controller enemy combatant. Similarly, we need now to add the stat bridge. So let's select the root game object. So, and let me collapse everything here as well. In this case, the stat system is in the root game object, so we need to add again the external stats manager. It's asking for the player stats, which is this guy here, so we can either drag it like this or drag the whole game object like so. Is the same thing. And also we need to add again the game key controller ORK bridge. ORK stats bridge is asking again for the main player stats system. There we go, and the external, as well as the combatant game object. So in this case it's going to be the AI player controller. This is the one having the combatant component. Let's click once again in the stats list, and we want set to ORK to game key controller. The current health is going to be mapped to the health itself. Let's add a new one. In this case is the max health from game key controller is mapped to the max HP, and we can leave it like that. Save the prefab, exit prefab mode. Now we have our enemy, but we don't want to just drag it up yet. Let's find a place not so near to where the player is spawning, so we don't want the enemy to be aggro right away. So let's find a place, let's see, maybe over here. So let's drag this guy over here. It's hard to tell if it's not colliding with the ground. Hope not. Okay, so following the documentation, it says that in the health HP stat to change the transfer mode from from ORK to game to both. So let's do that and save the changes in the scene. And let's check it out. So player stats, show hide stat info list. So let's click on that one. So we see that we have two stats, current health and max health. If we were now to expand those, current health 100. So let's give it a try. So this is the NPC. That is the enemy. And let's see if I can shoot. And we can see the current, let me pause, current health changed to 96. And once again, if I go now to the GKC enemy, where we have the combatant, and scroll down, and we can see also that the HP from ORK Framework changed to 96. So the bridge is working properly, that will say. We can also test this out by using the ORK Framework troubleshooter here, or debugger. So we can select the status that we want to affect, and let's give the 4 point that we removed before, so add 4 point to the HP. Change status is now 100. If we select once again the enemy, and we can see the current value is 100, so it is working perfectly fine. We can yet exit pause mode or the pause menu and let the enemy make damage to us, and in this case will be the player one character player controller. Down below the HP is not changing because ORK is not registering any damage to us, so in this case I will say that we need to also change in the, where was it? Of course that needs to be done in the prefab itself, not currently now because we are in play mode. We need to change to both to transfer the information to both. So in this case the damage is done by game key controller, so it needs to be transferred to ORK Framework because we already said previously that the stats manager is going to be handled by ORK Framework, which is not the case for the combatant now, for the player combatant. Okay, that's the reason we see no changes here. Anyways, if we were to check the stats system from the player, if I find it, so it was other player system, essential component, experience level stats, right? Numbers are 32. We see here the current value 67. So let's go back to the ORK component, select again the current HP, let's add let's see 33 and change status. Well, it will not allow us because we have the max HP set to 100 already, but let's see if it made any change here actually. No, it didn't. So let's try by selecting the max HP and change this guy to 200, and let's, instead of add, let's set 200, and afterwards we can add 33 to the HP. Now we have 133, and let's select the experience level stat system, and now we have 133. So in this case it works because remember we set for the player that ORK Framework will be the one driving the stats. Okay, so let's exit pause mode and stop play, and make sure to save any changes to the scene. Let's continue.